Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land. I hope that life is treating you well and that the sun is shining down on you with a beneficent smile, much like a mother who's spotted her child doing something adorable and cute. In this episode, we're going to take a look at something a bit different, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. I'm starting a new series called The History of the English Language. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. So if you're interested in classic literature, there is a good chance that you're also interested in language. Whether that's because you like languages and have learned many, or you only speak your native language, we recognise that literature is made from language. But the one thing about literature and why language is so fascinating is because when it comes to being put into the written form, a language goes from just expressing objects of the material world, day-to-day things, day-to-day emotions, to suddenly being able to bring to life imagination and concepts such as science fiction, going forward in time, or reinterpreting the past. This is only possible through the written medium, through the development of language. Now, the English language is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is spoken by northward of 1.5 billion people on the planet to a greater or lesser extent. On top of that, the English language has a sort of singular capacity for absorbing other languages. And since so much of the Western canon, due to the influence of the British Empire, unfortunately, since so much of literature and its ideas have come in the form of the English language, although by no means are they the greatest, I think of plenty of other countries who have got greater writers than the English, with perhaps the exception of the playwright Shakespeare, who pretty darn good, if you ask me. How has English come to be this language that is from a small island spoken by so many people that when we look at the beginning and its origins, it's gone from maybe a mean, tough, thick-skinned speech to giving rise to epic works like Milton's Paradise Lost, like the Gettysburg Address 7 years ago. You know, that was my Abraham Lincoln impression. Here's another president. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. That's my best JFK impression. Thank you very much. It sounds more like a JFK from The Simpsons, I know. So much power has come through language that I thought a series on how the English language has developed through history might be something that you classic lovers will enjoy to pass your time listening to. So let's get stuck in to the beginning of the English language. Since language fundamentally is developed by the need for community, then a greater society, and builds from sort of the everyday essentials outwards, and is influenced by seismic events like migrations, subjugation, invasion, battles, big political upheavals, I thought the best place to start with talking about the history of the English language is with the demographic setup of the British Isles. And so let's just take a quick look at the peoples that were there. Up in the left-hand corner of Europe, on this trifling little isle of which the historian Tacitus said its climate is wretched with its frequent rains and mists, the first people to really occupy it were the Britons, from which it gets the name Britain. The Britons were Celts. So you had those first. A bit later, you had the settling of the Picts in the north of the island, which we would call Scotland today. They came from Scythia, which is Bulgaria, Romania, then over the top of the Black Sea, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, all the stands. They were a nomadic people, and they came along and tried to settle in Ireland to start with, but they couldn't stay there because of the Scots. That's right, the Scots were in Ireland originally. So the Picts moved further north into the top part of mainland Britain. And then after that, you had the Romans turn up. So 55 BCE, you have Caesar with his Veni Vidi Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. But it was around 43 CE that the Emperor of Rome sent over more armies to settle in Britain, to bring it into the Roman Empire up to Hadrian's Wall, which separates Scotland and Britain. So that's really the setup of the British peoples to start with. But in the early to mid 5th century, when the Franks and the Goths had sacked Rome, Rome began to withdraw its legions from Britain and leave it to fend for itself. And it's around this time that things begin to get interesting for us. As long as the Romans were in Britain, the Picts up north were unable to make any headway in what we would call England today. And the Scots from Ireland, they could try and invade, but the legions of Rome were very disciplined, and even though outnumbered, would frequently be able to push back and defend their piece of territory in Britannia. But when they withdrew, the Britons who were left, who the Romans had integrated with, they were left now to take over the administration, the towns, which were prosperous in many areas. They had very fertile land. And now with the removal of these strong military characters, the Romans, the Picts and the Scots began to invade and began to notice that the pickings were quite easy. So what the Britons do, you have a king of the Britons, I believe it's Vortigern was the one. He realises that they're losing land, sort of hand over fist kind of thing, and he needs help. The Britons are not strong enough. They've relied on the Romans to do the fighting for them, so they don't know how to fend off these invasions. And so the king comes up with the idea, I'll rent some mercenaries from across the sea, from the Germanic tribes, and, they can come and sort the Picts and the Scots out, and everyone will be happy. And so he invites over people from what would be called the Angles and the Saxons, and from the northern parts of the Germanic area. And over they come as mercenaries, and they beat the Picts and they beat the Scots, and everyone's happy. But that's when the king makes an absolute howler of a decision. He decides, I don't quite have the money to pay the mercenaries. And naturally, the mercenaries get a bit upset and start sacking all these towns. And then they find out too what the Picts and the Scots already knew, that Britain is there for the taking. And it's a very fertile, rich, productive, resourceful land, better than where they've come from. So they get on the old blower and tell families back home, why don't you pack up and come and join us in Britain, because we're going to settle here. So we know who the peoples were that came across because of the Venerable Bede, a monk from the monastery of Lindisfarne, high up in Northumberland. And he says that fundamentally there are 5 people in Britain. He wrote this at the end of the 6th century. He said you have the Britons, you have the Latins, you have the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. So the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes are these invaders. They were first mercenaries to help, but now are invading. They're just migrating over and taking over the land. So the Angles, they come from the northern part of Germany. The Saxons from Old Saxony. The Jutes thought to be from the northern part of Denmark because of the name Jutland over there. You also had the Frisians as well from sort of the Dutch area. And over they come and they begin to settle themselves in little communities up the coast, the southeast coast of England, then up the east of England, the Isle of Wight at the bottom of England. Now, why are these people so important? It's simple. It's from the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes that we get Old English. In fact, England is basically a contraction of Angleland, the Angles and the Saxons. Now, one thing that's easy to do here is to oversimplify the story, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but don't think that they're just one homogeneous people who all understand each other. This is long before our day. So without communications, Germany was made up of lots of different villages and small tribes, small kingdoms. In fact, at one point in Britain, through these people, there were 12 different kingdoms on the British Isles. So they were by no means just one lump. We talk about the Saxons, but if you look at the map back then, you have the West Saxons, and you can tell that because the area of the map is called Wessex, West Saxon. You have Sussex or South Saxon. You have Middlesex or the Middle Saxons. So when we talk about the Saxons, it's easy to think, oh, the Saxons from Saxony, that's it. They're just one group of people. Actually, that's not true. Saxon comes from the carrying of a particular blade or sword, which was the seax. So you can see how someone who carries the seax or uses the seax is called a Saxon or Saxon. So you could have Angles who used these swords, and they would be noticed as the Saxons. The Jutes from the Isle of Wight and that area, the southern part, became part of Wessex, Seax. So there's a whole milieu of different groups of villages and towns that have come from abroad because they know there's fertile land. Now, yes, they've got a connected language, but it's by no means uniform. If you think of the extremes of dialects within one language, so in England at the moment, you could have someone from Birmingham who talks like that, right? My name is Tristan and I come from Birmingham. Whereas you've got other people in the north, like Geordies, and when they talk, they sort of talk like up and down in sort of a rhythm, like they're on waves. So that's the same language, but different accents. Also, you have local dialectisms, the way that words are used. There's loads of them, even within England today. So if you were to go back 1,500 years, can you imagine how broad and different those words could be, even though you could have a similar structure? And so even amongst the invaders, the English language is not totally settled. What's fascinating about the language that's used at this point, because the Britons, remember, are Celts, is that not many Celtic or Briton words are kept in the English language. Some are adopted because naturally as the Saxons and the Angles move in to take over certain places, they meet the resident Britons and maybe they trade one or two words, but there's not many. It's called the Celtic Question. Why do so few Celtic words exist in the English language? You get some, like Kent, the area that is landed in by the Jutes, it's thought, comes from the word canto, which is Celtic. You have words like Thames, which is also Celtic. And then words like Dover, which means water. That's Celtic too. And what you'll notice about these areas is they're actually very mercantile areas, which by comparison to the rest of Britain, are highly populated. So maybe the only way the Celtic language stayed was because of a large population, which lasted for a long time. So there are little bits of Celtic. However, overall, the Saxons and Angles push out the Britons. At least, even if they don't displace them, they subjugate them severely enough to not really need their language. Now, there's two arguments for why this could be. It could be that they so despised their neighbours that they didn't want to use their language, or maybe because they've all been influenced by Rome at some point in the past, maybe they're so similar in their way of living that they didn't need to borrow any Celtic words. They already had a whole Saxon vocabulary which dealt with day-to-day life, and they cooperated. They had a similar societal setup anyway. Over the course of time, about a century, the Anglo-Saxons push up through most of England, up to Scotland, and they go across to Wales, but not into Wales. And they also get down towards the county of Cornwall, but don't go there. And actually today, you will still notice that Celtic is spoken in Wales, and in Cornwall, they have their own dialects. What's interesting about Wales is once the Saxons had got to that point, they actually called the Britons who had been pushed back and who didn't integrate, they called them Wialas, which means slave. So it does say that they subjugated the Britons, but Wialas, let's say it, Wales, that's where we get the word Wales from. It means the slave's place, which the Saxons didn't quite push into. So we're beginning to see how language is formed just by demographics, by geography, and by migration. We did mention as well that although the legions of Rome had retreated like over a century and a half before by this point, of course there were still Latin people who had settled in Britain and were still there. And the Latin words that enter the language, they are there, but it's amazing that they're not that prevalent. A lot of people think there's a lot of Latin in because the Romans were here. Well, about 150 words stayed from Latin at this time. And you had things like the word for wall is Latin. Epistola means letter, so we get epistolary or an epistle. That is a Latin word. You get words like Chester or Cesta, which means camp. So you think of place names like the city of Chester or Chesterfield or Cirencester. It means camp something. So what we find then is that despite the Celts, despite the Latins being in Britain, the Anglo-Saxons had come with this veritable strongbox of a vocabulary which didn't need to adopt anything, or at least it didn't seem to. It adopted some things like the Latin because maybe, the word for mortar is Latin, and the Saxons may not have had that word, so they just borrowed it. Overall, they were perfectly equipped with a language that satisfied their day-to-day needs. And the longevity of those words is still seen in so many place names as a start. For instance, Ham. If you find a place called Rotherham, as we call it today, but it's spelled Rotherham, or Birmingham, or Northampton, Ham means farm, and it's actually Old English. It comes from the Anglo-Saxons. Another word that comes from the Anglo-Saxons with place names is Wick, which means a fortified town or settlement, but it's more than just a small village because Wick involves commerce. It's sort of an artisanal kind of village where there might be a marketplace. So over in an area of England called East Anglia, there's the Angles, you have Norwich, which is actually spelled Norwich or Wick. You have Ipswich. Over in the Midlands, you have Warwick or Warwick. Down near London, you have Chiswick. We actually say Chiswick nowadays. So these are left over from the Anglo-Saxons. And just another word that you'll see a lot of in place names in Britain is the word ton. So Milton Keynes, for example. Ton means fortified village. And later on, as fortified villages expanded, the word slightly changed later in history and you get the word town from it. But despite all this history, you might be thinking, does it all matter what the Anglo-Saxons spoke? Because after all, that was so long ago, English doesn't sound like that. And wasn't it all Latin and the French invasion that caused England to have its words? Well, I'm going to read something to you now which may surprise you. In fact, it may blow your merry socks off. In any language, there are the certain words which form the foundation of all languages. They are the most fundamental words. Now, for the English language, I would like to read to you the top 100 words which form basically the crux, the very heart of the English language, the words that tie it together, which are most rudimentary to forming a grammatical structure to speak with. I'll put the words on screen and follow along. They are the, of, and, a, to, in, is, you, that, it, he, was, for, on, are, as, with, his, they, I, at, be, this, have, from, or, one, had, by, word, but, not, what, all, were, we, when, your, can, said, their, use, an, each, which, she, do, how, their, if, will, up, other, about, out, many, then, them, these, so, some, her, would, make, like, him, into, time, has, look, to, more, right, go, see, number, know, way, could, people, my, than, first, water, been, call, who, oil, it's, now, find, long, down, day, did, get, come, made, may, part. Those are the top 100 spoken words in the English language. One of them is French, and that was the word number. 3 of them are Viking or Norse, which are they, them, and their. The other 96 are Old English words or Anglo-Saxon. So when we say it is the English language, at its beating heart, it truly is. And just maybe the fact that you had so many tribes, little kingdoms on Britain, and such a tumultuous time as people tried to establish a full sovereignty over the whole mainland, maybe that contributed to the fact that later on they were able to adapt each other's words, adopt them, co-opt them, and get used to the idea of just not inventing new words, but just taking a word from a people that already had a word for an object. And that brings us back, finally, in this part of the story, to Latin. At the turn of the 7th to 8th century, St. Augustine turns up in Britain preaching the gospel of Christ. And he's only one. Of course, there's a whole slew of missionaries that toddle over to Britain, bringing the message of the Bible of the Church of Rome. And they very quickly influence and win over the support of the ruling families, particularly the ruling ladies of the families are very supportive of this new religion, and they endorse the missionaries and the monks who follow them, and so the monasteries are set up. What was so amazing about this, or so important about this, was that these missionaries came over with the Roman alphabet. And the Roman alphabet was so different to what the Anglo-Saxons were used to, which was runic writing. Now, runic writing is very straight lines, hard edges, triangular. It's good for etching on rock. It's good for scratching onto sticks. But paper and vellum, the new medium of writing, rune's not so good for that. But the roundedness and the fluidity of the Roman alphabet was much better for writing. And since the monks were constantly recording and writing, and then the elite of the day wanted to read to get that learning, guess what they learned to write in? They wrote the Latin alphabet. And here's sort of the end of runic writing, ultimately. Now, the monks may write various things in Latin to do with religion, and of course this brings in a whole range of ideas which are new to the English. For instance, the idea of sin, the idea of a saviour who is mild and meek, not a warrior, the idea of saints. These things are brand new and they don't have words for that. And so words start coming into the English language brought from the Latin, which are really important because it's the language of their belief in God, which is very central. But not only that, the monks have a history in explaining the administration of the day, taking records for law and for finance, riveting stuff. Amongst all of this, the monks also began to write in English, because that, after all, was the language of the ruling classes, but they were turning it into the Latin script. So they had to formulate the language, sort of begin to try and find a standard. But being as people were so separated, different areas spoke in a different way, and it means you get different ways of writing. because the way you write is phonetically. So we mentioned that the blade, seax. When you first look at it, seax, the modern tongue sort of tries to say sax, sex, but it was seax. So you think of the sea, the ocean. Somebody back in Old English, if they saw sea, would say sea. They would pronounce it as it was. And so this starts coming into the English language. And from here, we get the Old English alphabet, which I'm about to put on the screen now. One of the things I love about this, it's 24 letters, but the piece that I find most fascinating, do you see the letter U? Well, after that, what do you have? This two U's, which would later become known as double U, W. So that's just a little novelty hidden away in the English language's history. There was something else about writing the English language that was so liberating and spurred it on to become what it would eventually be. We've mentioned already that one thing that literature gives you, written language, is that you can begin to bring into reality thoughts which are not real. So we can make up stories of animals which are talking. We can imagine spaceships out there traveling at the speed of light. Your feelings, your emotions, your philosophies, which are hard to actually put into words, you can start with writing. You can put your thoughts down and make them something real in front of you. And that opens up a world of new ideas, which brings in new words. Now, of course, one of the greatest areas that this would be in religion, particularly Christianity, as far as the Anglo-Saxons went, because there were so many new concepts for them. And yet, obviously, they would learn to say not just the Latin words, but they would learn to speak with their own English. And I'd like to read you something which I find rather moving. See if you know what this sentence means. And forgive us ura giltas, swa we forgifav urum giltendum. What do you think that means? Well, actually, if you look at the first word, and, that's Old English, forgive us, ura, so our, forgive us our giltas. Well, guilt, trespass. Isn't that amazing? This is the sentence, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And there's a little mixture of Latin in there too. So isn't that amazing? If you read Old English, I'm no linguist, I can't read Old English, but that little sentence, I recognise a couple of the words, the birth of the English language coming into writing. We hear the whisper, we hear the faint murmuring heartbeat of the beginning of a language that would grow to spread all over the world, have 1.5 billion speakers, and give birth to the Gettysburg Address. But not just the Gettysburg Address. I want to leave you with this thought about Old English and how it's at the centre of English today. It's not all French and Latin. Do you remember Winston Churchill's famous speech? We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them in the streets and the towns. We shall fight them on the hills and the landing grounds. We will never surrender. That entire motivating piece of rhetoric is all using Old English words, Anglo-Saxon words, with the exception of one, surrender, which is not Old English. And that's interesting in itself, isn't it? Maybe the Old English never had a word for surrender, because they were this mighty, valiant, fighting people. So that's our first episode of the history of the English language. Please, please, please tell me what you think down below. Are you excited to have this series continue and watch as the English language grows and develops and morphs and twists and takes some shocking turns to become what it is today and its effect on culture around the world? I hope you've enjoyed this. And until the next time, I wish you joy in your reading.